What if I told you that sometimes the most beautiful places hold the darkest secrets? That a pristine lake, surrounded by ancient pines, could become a stage for something so violent, so inexplicable, that it would haunt an entire nation for decades? Close your eyes for a moment. Can you smell the pine resin in the air? Feel the soft moss beneath your feet? Hear the gentle lapping of water against the shore? This is Lake Bodom in the summer of 1960, a place where fairy tales should live, not nightmares. Picture this. It's early June in Finland. The midnight sun barely sets, painting everything in that ethereal, golden light that makes you believe magic is real. For teenagers decide to spend a night by this lake, just outside Helsinki, a place so peaceful, so removed from the chaos of the world that nothing bad could ever happen there. They were wrong. But before we descend into that darkness, let me tell you about these four young souls, because they weren't just victims in a famous case. They were living, breathing, dreaming human beings with hearts full of hope and futures stretching endlessly before them. Mila Ermely, 15 years old, with eyes that sparkle when she laughed, and she laughed often. Picture her. Blonde hair catching the sunlight, a smile that could light up the darkest room. She was the kind of girl who believed in the goodness of people, who saw beauty in everything around her. When she walked into a room, conversations became livelier, colors seemed brighter. Her friend said she had this gift of making everyone feel like they mattered. She was dating Nils, and those who knew them said they looked at each other the way only first love allows, with complete wonder, as if they discovered something no one else in the world had ever felt before. Can you remember that feeling? That intoxicating certainty that this person, this moment, this love would last forever? Then there was Anya Talicki, also 15, but different from Mila in the way that complementary souls often are. Where Mila was sunshine, Anya was moonlight, thoughtful, observant, the kind of person who noticed things others missed. She read poetry in her spare time, wrote letters to her grandmother every week, and had this habit of collecting smooth stones from lakes and rivers, believing each one held a memory worth keeping. Anya was seeing Seppo, and their relationship had a quieter intensity. They could sit together for hours without speaking, perfectly content in each other's presence. She was the one who suggested the camping trip. She'd been to Lake Bodom before with her family and remembered how peaceful it felt, how the water seemed to hold the sky in its embrace. Seppo Antero, 18, was everything you'd want in a first love. Gentle but strong, protective without being possessive. He worked part-time at a local garage, his hands often stained with motor oil, but he'd scrub 'em clean before taking Anya's hand. He was the kind of young man who carried your books without being asked, who remembered your favorite flower, who made you feel safe just by being there. His friends described him as steady, the one who'd talk you out of doing something stupid, the one who'd be there when things went wrong. He rode a motorcycle, which made him seem dangerous to parents, but was really just his way of feeling free. When he picked up Anya for their dates, he always brought an extra helmet, adjusted to fit her perfectly. And then there was Nils Wilhelm, also 18, tall for his time at nearly 6 feet, with that Nordic blonde hair that seemed to glow in the summer light. He was more complex than the others, quieter, more introspective. While Seppo was steady like a rock, Nils was like water, adaptable, sometimes unpredictable, capable of both gentleness and intensity. He came from a family that expected things from him: success, respectability, the kind of life that looked good on paper. But Nils was a dreamer, the kind of young man who'd stare at the horizon and wonder what lay beyond it. When he looked at Mila, his friend said you could see his whole future rearranging itself around her smile. These four young people, each carrying their own dreams, their own fears, their own beautiful, messy humanity, decided to spend a night under the stars. It was supposed to be romantic, innocent, the kind of memory that would make them smile when they were old and gray. Instead, it became something else entirely. If you believe stories like this should be told, consider liking, commenting, and subscribing. The day was June 4th, 1960. Finland was still finding its identity in the post-war world, caught between East and West, traditional and modern. For teenagers like our four protagonists, the world felt full of possibilities. Rock and roll was changing everything. Elvis was king, and young people everywhere were beginning to believe they could write their own stories. Mila spent that morning at home, humming while she packed. Her mother would later remember how excited she was, how she'd changed clothes 3 times, wanted to look perfect for Nils. She packed a summer dress, yellow, her favorite color, and spent extra time brushing her hair until it shone like spun gold. Can you imagine her standing in front of her bedroom mirror, practicing her smile, maybe stealing a bit of her mother's lipstick? She was 15 and in love, and the whole world seemed to shimmer with promise. Anya was more practical in her preparations, but no less excited. She brought books, always books, and a small camera her father had given her for her birthday. She wanted to capture the sunset over the lake, maybe some candid shots of her friends. She had this idea that years later, when they were all grown up and scattered to different corners of the world, these photographs would bring back the magic of this perfect weekend. She never got the chance to take those pictures. Seppo spent the afternoon checking his motorcycle, making sure everything was perfect for the ride to the lake. He was meticulous about these things. His bike was his pride and joy, but more than that, it was Anya's safety he was thinking about. He adjusted the seat, checked the tires twice, even bought a new helmet for her, one that matched her eyes. His mother watched him from the kitchen window, noting how carefully he prepared everything. Later, she would say she had a strange feeling that day, a mother's intuition that something wasn't right. Seppo seemed so happy, so full of life, that she pushed the feeling away. Nils was different that day. His friends would remember it later, during the investigations, during the long nights of trying to understand what happened. He seemed restless, not anxious exactly, but like he was carrying some invisible weight. When someone asked if he was excited about the camping trip, he'd smiled and said yes, but his eyes seemed somewhere else entirely. Was it premonition, young love's uncertainty, or something darker that we'll never understand? These are the questions that would haunt everyone who knew him. By evening, they were all ready. For young people, 2 motorcycles, camping gear, and hearts full of anticipation. They met at the agreed spot as the sun began its lazy descent toward the horizon, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. Can you see them? The way they must have looked at each other, checking that everyone was ready, maybe stealing quick kisses when they thought no one was looking. This was their adventure, their moment of freedom, their chance to be adults in a world that still saw them as children. The ride to Lake Bodom took about an hour, winding through countryside that seemed painted by the gods themselves. Finland in summer is unlike anywhere else on Earth. The light seems to come from everywhere and nowhere, creating a landscape that feels both familiar and otherworldly. Picture Mila's arms wrapped around Nils's waist as they rode, her hair streaming behind them like a golden banner. Feel the vibration of the engine beneath them, the wind that carried the scent of pine and wildflowers. This was freedom incarnate. Young love on 2 wheels, racing toward a perfect night. Anya held on to Seppo more tightly than usual. Something about the way the shadows fell that evening made her feel small, vulnerable. But Seppo's back was warm and solid against her cheek, and his confidence was infectious. When he turned his head to check on her, his smile could have powered the whole city of Helsinki. They stopped once along the way, at a small store where they bought supplies they'd forgotten, matches, chocolate, a bottle of soda to share. The storekeeper will remember them later. How happy they seemed, how they laughed at everything and nothing. Young love, he'd called it, shaking his head with the wisdom of someone who'd forgotten what it felt like to believe the world was made of possibilities. As they approached Lake Bodom, the landscape changed. The trees grew taller, older, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the evening light into dancing patterns. The air grew cooler, carried with it the scent of water and something else, something ancient and wild that made the hair on your arms stand up. But our four teenagers were too caught up in each other to notice any warning signs. They were invincible, weren't they? Young and in love and absolutely certain that nothing bad could ever touch them. They found the perfect spot, a small clearing near the water's edge, protected by trees but open enough to see the stars. The lake stretched before them like a mirror, so still it seemed solid, reflecting the sky so perfectly you couldn't tell where one ended and the other began. It's perfect, Mila breathed, and for a moment it was... Setting up camp became a comedy of errors that would have been endearing to watch. Nils and Seppo, trying to prove their competence to their girlfriends, fumbled with tent poles and argued about the best way to secure the guy lines. Mila and Anya, supposedly there to help, spent more time giggling than actually contributing to the effort. Can you hear their laughter echoing across the water? Can you feel the warm evening air on your skin? Smell the pine needles beneath your feet? This was happiness in its purest form, uncomplicated, unself-conscious, untainted by the knowledge of what was coming. When they finally got the tent erected, crooked but functional, they stood back to admire their work with the pride of pioneers conquering new territory. It wasn't much to look at that small blue tent, but it represented everything to them. Independence, adventure, a night that belonged entirely to them. Anya pulled out her camera and started taking pictures. There's something heartbreaking about imagining her behind that viewfinder, framing moments she believed would last forever. Click. Mila and Nils struggling with sleeping bags. Click. Seppo building a small fire ring with stones from the shore. Click. All four of them together, arms around each other, grinning at the camera as if they'd just discovered the secret to eternal happiness. As darkness finally claimed the sky, and in Finnish summer, darkness comes reluctantly, like a shy guest who doesn't want to interrupt the party. They build a small fire, not for warmth, really, but for the magic of it. Fire has always drawn humans together, hasn't it? Something about the flickering light, the dancing shadows, the way it makes even the most ordinary conversation feel profound. They roasted sausages on sticks cut from birch branches, shared chocolate that melted on their fingers, told stories that seemed impossibly important in the firelight. Nils had brought a small radio, and they tuned into a station playing American rock and roll, the music mixing with the gentle lapping of waves against the shore. Can you picture them? For young faces illuminated by firelight, eyes bright with joy and possibility, Mila's laugh ringing out over the water when Nils told a particularly bad joke, Anya leaning against Seppo's shoulder, perfectly content, the way the flames reflected in their eyes, making them seem almost otherworldly. This was their golden hour, the time when everything felt possible, when a future stretched ahead like an endless summer. None of them could have imagined that within hours, 3 of them would be dead, and the 4th would begin a lifetime of carrying the weight of survival. As the night deepened, their conversation grew more intimate, the way it does when you're surrounded by darkness and the only light comes from your small circle of warmth. They talked about their dreams. Milo wanted to be a teacher, to fill classrooms with the same joy she brought to everything else. Anya dreamed of traveling, of seeing the world beyond Finland's borders, maybe becoming a photographer or a writer. Seppo wanted to open his own garage someday, to build something with his hands that would last. And Nils talked about wanting to understand things, to figure out how the world really worked beneath its beautiful surface. Even then, there was something searching about him, something that seemed to be looking for answers to questions he couldn't quite articulate. They played a game. If you could live anywhere in the world, where would it be? If you could have any superpower, what would you choose? If this night could last forever, would you want it to? The kind of questions that seem silly until you realize they're really about hope, about the future, about the infinite possibility that comes with being young and alive. As the fire burned lower, they moved closer together, not just for warmth but for comfort, for the simple human need to be near the people you love. Mila curled up against Nils's chest, his arm around her shoulders. Anya and Seppo sat hand in hand, her head on his shoulder, both of them staring into the dying flames as if they could read their future there. The radio played softer now, love songs that seemed written specifically for this moment, this place, these four hearts beating in synchrony with the rhythm of the lake. Someone, probably Anya, always a thoughtful one, mentioned how perfect this was, how they should do this every summer, grow old together, become the kind of friends who never lose touch. Promise, Mila said, her voice soft with sleepiness and contentment. Promise will always be like this. They all promised. Young people always do. Around midnight, they finally retreated to the tent. It was crowded with all four of them, sleeping bags overlapping, the air warm with breath and closeness. They whispered in the darkness for a while, the kind of half-asleep conversations that feel profound in the moment but disappear with the morning light. One by one, they drifted off to sleep, peaceful, safe, surrounded by love and friendship, and the absolute certainty that morning would bring nothing but more happiness. They were so very, very wrong. What happens in the hours between midnight and dawn? What forces move in that liminal space when the conscious world sleeps and only dreams and nightmares hold sway? Somewhere in the darkness around Lake Bodom, something stirred. Not something supernatural, though it might as well have been for how inexplicable it was. Someone human, but carrying within him a darkness so profound it defied understanding. Picture the lake at 3 a.m, the water black as obsidian, the surrounding forest a wall of shadows. The only light comes from stars and a thin slice of moon, barely enough to cast the faintest silhouettes. It's the kind of darkness that makes you understand why our ancestors fear the night, why children hide under blankets, why even brave adults feel their hearts beat faster in the small hours. Our four teenagers slept on, innocent and unaware, in the tent. Their breathing created a small pocket of warmth in the vast coldness of the finished night. Mila murmured something in her sleep, maybe a fragment of a dream. Nils stirred but didn't wake. Seppo's arm tightened protectively around Anya even in sleep. But outside, in that endless darkness, something was watching, waiting, planning. Who was it? We may never know for certain. But imagine for a moment what it takes to approach a tent full of sleeping teenagers with murder in your heart. What darkness must consume a person to make such a choice? What breaks inside a human being to turn them into something capable of what happened next? Have you ever been woken from deep sleep by violence? That moment when your mind struggles to process reality, when the safe world of dreams collides with a nightmare you can't escape. This is how death came to Lake Bodom. Sudden, brutal, inexplicable. The killer didn't enter the tent. No, that would have been too simple, too straightforward. Instead, they chose a method that speaks to a particularly cruel kind of calculation. They cut to the canvas walls from outside, slicing through the fabric that had promised shelter and safety. Ed in their sleeping bags, trapped in a maze of canvas and panic. Imagine waking to the sound of your sanctuary being destroyed, cold air rushing in where warmth had been, tent collapsing on top of you, trapping you in fabric that had protected you just moments before. In their confusion and terror, our four teenagers became tangled in their sleeping bags, trapped in a maze of canvas and panic. Mila's voice, high and terrified, calling out for Nils. Anya, always calm, trying to make sense of what was happening. Seppo, protective instincts kicking in, trying to shield Anya with his own body. And Nils, struggling to clear his head, to understand why their perfect night had turned into chaos. The weapons were primitive but devastatingly effective. A knife, the kind any camper might carry, turned into an instrument of murder. A stone, picked up from the very shore where they'd sat and laughed just hours before, now wielded with deadly intent. But here's what chills me most. The attack wasn't random. It wasn't frenzied. It was methodical, calculated, designed to ensure that escape was impossible. Whoever did this had thought it through, planned it, approached it with the kind of cold logic that's somehow more terrifying than heat-of-the-moment violence. Seppo died trying to protect Anya. Even as his own life ebbed away, his last instinct was to shield the girl he loved. Anya, quiet and thoughtful Anya, whose dreams of traveling the world ended in a tent by a lake she'd once thought was the most beautiful place on earth. And Mila, beautiful, laughing Mila, who had promised they'd always be like this, who had believed in the goodness of people with every fiber of her being. The attack on her was particularly brutal, as if her joy had somehow offended the darkness that had come calling. But Nils lived. What does consciousness feel like when you wake up in hell? When the last thing you remember is falling asleep surrounded by love, and you wake to find yourself alone among the dead. Nils came to slowly, his mind struggling through layers of pain and confusion. His face was shattered, jaw broken, skull fractured, the kind of injuries that should have killed him, that maybe were meant to kill him. Can you imagine that moment of realization? The slow, horrible understanding that the warm bodies beside you are no longer warm, that the friends who were whispering and laughing just hours ago will never speak again. His memory was fractured, scattered like broken glass. Fragment of images, sounds, sensations, but no coherent narrative. Did he see the attacker? Did he fight back? Did he beg for his life? Or did he simply receive those devastating blows and fall into unconsciousness, saved by chance or fate or some twisted mercy we'll never understand? Somehow, he found himself outside the collapsed tent. How did he get there? Did he crawl out on his own? Was he dragged? The questions multiplied like shadows, and Nils, 18 years old, in love, supposed to be invincible, had no answers. The sun was rising over Lake Bodom, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold that would have been beautiful in any other circumstance. But now the light only illuminated the horror, made the impossible scene undeniably real. In the distance, bird watchers were setting up their equipment, expecting nothing more than a glimpse of rare species in their natural habitat. Instead, they became witnesses to something far more disturbing. A young man, bloodied and broken, stumbling away from a collapsed tent where death had made its home. They saw him, that blond figure moving across the landscape like a ghost. but they were too far away to help, too shocked to immediately understand what they were seeing. By the time they realized something was terribly wrong, Nils had disappeared into the forest, leaving behind only questions that would echo for decades. At 11 o'clock that morning, a carpenter named Esko was taking his usual walk along the lake shore when he stumbled upon the scene that would haunt Finnish nightmares for generations to come. Can you imagine his shock? He was expecting nothing more than a peaceful morning walk, maybe the sight of early wildflowers or the sound of fish jumping in the still water. Instead, he found a collapsed tent, unnatural stillness, and the kind of silence that screams of violence. His first instinct was to call out, to see if anyone needed help. Camping accidents weren't unheard of. Maybe the tent had collapsed in the wind. Maybe someone was injured but alive. Hope is powerful, isn't it? It keeps us believing in happy endings, even when our eyes tell us otherwise. But as he got closer, as the scene became clearer, hope died as suddenly as our three young victims had. The police response was swift, but tragically inadequate. Within hours, the crime scene was overrun with investigators, officials, curiosity seekers, even soldiers called in to help with the search for missing items. Well-meaning people who had no idea they were destroying evidence with every footstep, contaminating what might have been the key to solving the murders. It's a particular kind of tragedy, isn't it? That the very people trying to help might have inadvertently ensured that justice would never be served. By the time they realized their mistake, the damage was done, footprints erased, evidence trampled. The careful story the crime scene might have told scattered to the wind like leaves in autumn, but the lake remembered. It always does. In the days that followed, Finland found itself gripped by a mystery that seemed to defy explanation. How could four teenagers, sleeping peacefully by a lake, become the victims of such calculated violence? Who could harbor such darkness in their heart? And why had one survived when three had not? The investigation revealed details that only deepened the mystery. The killer had taken items, not valuable things that would suggest robbery, but personal items that seemed almost intimate. Clothing, keys, small objects that had meaning only to the victims. And then there were Nils's shoes, found 500 meters from the tent, hidden deliberately, placed there with a care that suggested planning, intention, a mind that was working even in the aftermath of violence. But why? What possible reason could someone have for taking a survivor's shoes? Was it panic? Some twisted souvenir? Or something darker, more calculated? Part of a plan we couldn't possibly understand? The police worked tirelessly, following every lead, interviewing every possible witness. But the more they learned, the less they seemed to understand. This wasn't a crime of passion. It was too organized for that. But it wasn't a robbery either. Nothing of real value had been taken. What kind of person commits murder without clear motive? The kind that walks among us unseen, perhaps. The kind that smiles at neighbors and pays their taxes and harbors secrets so dark that even they might not fully understand them. As the investigation progressed, suspicion began to fall on various members of the community. Because that's what happens when evil strikes close to home. We start looking at our neighbors differently, wondering what darkness might be hiding behind familiar faces. First, there was a kiosk owner, Valdemar, a man whose hatred of campers was legendary, whose temper had frightened children and adults alike. Picture him. Whether hands had thrown stones at passing children, eyes that burned with resentment at the young people who invaded his territory with their laughter and joy. He confessed, during a drunken conversation with a neighbor, the words spilled out of him like poison. I did it. I killed those kids at Lake Bodom. But confessions from drunk, angry men aren't necessarily truth, are they? They can be fantasy, bravado, the desperate attempt of a bitter person to finally matter, to finally be feared instead of ignored. His wife provided an alibi. She swore he was home that night, sleeping beside her. For years, that seemed to settle the matter, until she was dying, and truth has a way of demanding to be heard when we're facing our final judgment. On her deathbed, she recanted, admitted she lied out of fear, fear of a man who had threatened to kill her if she told the truth about that night. She died with that confession on her lips, taking with her the weight of decades of silence. But by then, Valdemar was already dead, found drowned in Lake Bodom itself, the very water where the murders had taken place. Suicide, they said, or perhaps the lake claiming what was owed to it. Justice? Coincidence? Or something more profound, the kind of cosmic balance that operates outside human understanding? Then there was Hans, the naturalized citizen whose German accent still carried echoes of a darker time. In post-war Finland, being German was burden enough, but Hans carried additional weight. Rumors of past allegiances, whispers about activities during the war that were better left unspoken. The morning after the murders, he appeared at a Helsinki hospital. Picture the scene. Emergency room staff go about their business when this man walks in, clothes stained with what looked unmistakably like blood, behavior erratic, almost theatrical in its strangeness. The medical staff knew blood when they saw it. They'd seen enough during the war, enough in their daily work to recognize the real thing. But the police? They insisted the stains were paint. Just paint. Nothing to worry about. How convenient. How neat. How utterly unsatisfying. But here's the detail that chills me. After seeing news reports describing a blond man leaving the scene, Hans cut his hair. All of it. The long blonde locks that had been his defining feature. Gone in a single afternoon. Guilt? Vanity? Or the desperate act of someone trying to erase their connection to a crime. He moved to Sweden shortly after, disappearing into the anonymous crowds of another country. He died there decades later, taking whatever secrets he held to an unmarked grave, but not before investigators connected him with 5 other unsolved murders. 5. How many monsters walk among us, wearing the faces of ordinary citizens? How many secrets die with their keepers, leaving families forever wondering what really happened to their loved ones? And then there was Penny, barely 14 when the murders occurred, but already showing signs of the violence that would mark his adult life. In prison years later, serving time for other crimes, he would boast to a cellmate that he was responsible for Lake Bodom. But could a 14-year-old overpower for teenagers? Could child plan and execute such calculated brutality? We want our monsters to look like monsters, don't we? We want them to be adults, strangers, others. The idea that evil might wear the face of a child, might grow up among us undetected, is a thought too dark for most of us to hold. Yet evil has to start somewhere, doesn't it? It has to learn its craft, practice its cruelty, grow from small acts of violence into larger ones. Maybe Penny was telling the truth. Maybe the lake knew horrors we're not prepared to imagine. For 44 years, the case slept like the lake itself, seemingly peaceful on the surface, but with currents moving in the darkness below. New investigators took up the file, read the reports, stared at the crime scene photos, and found themselves as baffled as their predecessors. Then in 2004, new technology promised new answers. DNA evidence, blood analysis, the cold, clinical promise of science cutting through decades of speculation and theory. The target of this new investigation? Nils, the survivor, The victim who had carried the weight of that night for nearly half a century. Think about that for a moment. Imagine surviving something so traumatic that it fractures your memory, living with the whispers and questions for decades, carrying the guilt of survival, while your friends remain forever young in their graves. And then, when you're 62 years old and trying to live whatever peaceful life you can manage, police arrive at your door with handcuffs. Can you imagine the betrayal he must have felt? Not just from the justice system, but from the very people who were supposed to be seeking truth on behalf of his dead friends? The prosecution painted a picture that was both simple and devastating. A drunk 18-year-old boy, consumed by jealousy, attacks his girlfriend in a fit of rage. Maybe she rejected his advances. Maybe she looked at another boy. Maybe she simply said something that his young, alcohol-fueled mind couldn't handle. In the struggle that follows, he kills not just her, but everyone who witnessed his moment of violence. Then, in a display of calculated cruelty that would be impressive if it weren't so horrifying, he stages the entire scene. He hides evidence, wounds himself to appear as a victim, stumbles away from the tent to create the illusion of disorientation and innocence, then returns, playing unconscious until help arrives, gambling his life on the hope that his performance will be convincing enough to fool investigators. It's the kind of theory that makes sense on paper, isn't it? Clean, logical, all the pieces fit together, like a puzzle designed by someone who's never actually held a piece of human complexity in their hands. But theories are just stories we tell ourselves when the truth refuses to reveal itself. The evidence was compelling, in its way. Blood on shoes, DNA that seemed to tell a clear story, scientific analysis that cut through emotional confusion with the sharp blade of fact. But science can only tell us what happened, not why. And in the case of Nils and Lake Bodom, the why remained as elusive as ever. Nils's defense painted a different picture entirely. They spoke of wounds too severe to be self-inflicted, multiple skull fractures, a jaw shattered so completely that speaking was agony, the kind of trauma that kills most people and leaves survivors fundamentally changed. Could someone in that condition really have the presence of mind to stage an elaborate deception? Could an 18-year-old boy, his head fractured and bleeding, really have had the calculating intelligence to hide evidence, plant false clues, and perform his way through police investigation? The defense brought in experts who explained the nature of traumatic brain injury, how it affects memory, judgment, the very sense of self. They painted a picture of a young man whose survival was miraculous, whose confusion was real, whose inability to remember was a mercy rather than a convenience. But perhaps most powerfully, they asked the simplest question of all. Why? Why would a young man in love destroy everything he cared about? What jealousy could drive someone to such calculated brutality? What rage could sustain itself long enough to plan, execute, and cover up such horror? The prosecution never answered that question. Not really. They painted Nils as a monster, without ever explaining how an 18-year-old boy becomes capable of such monstrosity overnight. In the end, the court agreed with the defense. The evidence was insufficient. The theories, however compelling, remained just that, theories. The prosecution had built a case on scientific evidence, but had failed to construct a motive that made human sense. Nils walked free. But freedom, as he would learn, is relative. He received compensation for his ordeal. Money that could never buy back the years of suspicion, the decades of doubt, the weight of being the only one who survived. But compensation implies that justice was served, doesn't it? That wrongs were made right, that the system worked as it should. Yet here we are, decades later, and the murders remain unsolved. The families of the victims still wait for answers that may never come. And somewhere, whether alive or dead, a killer has never faced consequences for that night by the lake. Can you imagine what it's like to be acquitted of a crime, but never truly cleared? To have your innocence proclaimed in a courtroom while whispers follow you in the street? To know that every person you meet might be wondering, did he do it? Nils tried to rebuild his life, to find some semblance of normalcy in a world that would never again feel safe. But how do you move forward when the past refuses to stay buried? How do you trust your own memories when experts have called them into question? How do you love again when the last time you loved, everyone around you died? He gave interviews over the years, always maintaining his innocence, always expressing bewilderment at the accusations. When reporters asked how he could be certain of his innocence if he couldn't remember what happened, his answer was heartbreakingly simple. I know, because I am innocent. That's all. The faith of a man who has nothing left but his own sense of self. Is it touching or terrifying? The line between conviction and delusion can be thinner than we'd like to believe. But what if he really was innocent? What if the real killer was someone else entirely? Someone who had watched the investigation focus on Nils with satisfaction, knowing that the survivor made the perfect scapegoat. What if justice wasn't just delayed, but actively misdirected? This is where the story becomes something more than just another unsolved crime, isn't it? Because the questions it raises cut the heart of how we understand justice, truth, and the very nature of evil itself. What if Nils was guilty? What does it say about our justice system that trauma and memory loss could provide the perfect defense for the perfect crime? That someone could literally get away with murder because their own brain protected them from the memory of their actions? But what if he was innocent? What does it say about our hunger for answers that we would convict a victim rather than live with uncertainty? That we would rather have a convenient solution than admit that some mysteries may never be solved? And what if the truth is something else entirely? What if that night by Lake Bodom revealed something about human nature that we're not prepared to understand? Some capacity for evil that exists in spaces we don't want to acknowledge? I think about the randomness of it sometimes. For teenagers, chosen seemingly at random from all the young people in Finland. Why them? Why that night? Why that place? The arbitrariness is almost more terrifying than any motive we could imagine. Because if evil can strike without reason, without warning, without the comforting logic of cause and effect, then none of us are safe. None of us can protect ourselves by being good or careful or innocent. Sometimes darkness just falls. I keep thinking about those bird watchers. Imagine standing in the morning mist, binoculars in hand, expecting nothing more than a glimpse of a rare species. Instead, you witness the aftermath of something so violent, so incomprehensible, that it changes the way you see the world forever. They saw a blond man walking away from the scene. Was it Nils, dazed and injured, stumbling away from the horror? Was it the killer, calm and calculated, already planning his next move? Or was it someone else entirely, a witness, perhaps, too frightened to come forward? In my mind's eye, I see that figure often, neither hurrying nor dawdling, but moving with purpose across the finished landscape as the sun rises over Lake Bodom. In some versions of my imagination, it's Nils, broken and confused, seeking help that would never truly come. In others, it's a stranger, a monster in human form, disappearing into the forest with blood on his hands and secrets in his heart. But sometimes in the darkest corners of my thoughts, I wonder if it was something else entirely. Some other player in this tragedy that we've never identified, never even suspected. A shadow that has moved through this story unseen, watching as we focus on the obvious suspects while the real truth remained hidden. The bird watchers are old now if they're still alive. Do they still remember that morning? Do they dream about the figure they saw? Do they wish they had acted differently? Called out, try to help? Or do they understand, as perhaps we all should, that some moments are too large for human intervention? That sometimes we are simply witnesses to forces beyond our control or comprehension? Violence has this way of spreading, doesn't it? Like ripples in still water. It touches shores we never expected, changes landscapes we thought were safe from its influence. The families of the victims were destroyed by loss, certainly, but their pain rippled outward, touching friends, classmates, teachers who remembered bright young faces that would never age. Mila's mother kept her room exactly as she'd left it for decades, as if preserving the space might somehow preserve the girl who would never come home. Anya's father stopped taking photographs. The camera that had brought him such joy became a reminder of the pictures his daughter would never take, the moments she would never capture. He sold his equipment and never spoke of photography again. Seppo's garage job remained unfilled for months. His tools sat exactly where he'd left them, waiting for hands that would never return to shape metal into something useful, something lasting. And Nils carried the weight of all their unlived lives, their unfulfilled dreams, their silenced laughter. Can you imagine the survivor's guilt? Not just the normal kind, the why me anguish that comes with any tragedy, but the specific torture of being suspected of causing the very deaths that haunt your dreams? The community around Lake Bodom changed too. Parents started accompanying their teenagers on camping trips. Young couples chose different lakes, different shores, different places to make their memories. The lake itself gained a reputation that persists to this day. Beautiful but cursed, peaceful but dangerous. Property values dropped. Tourism dwindled. The local economy, which had depended on the lake's pristine reputation, withered like a plant denied sunlight. Eel doesn't just destroy individuals. It poisons entire ecosystems of human connection and trust. But perhaps most profoundly, the case changed how Finland understood itself. This was a country that prided itself on safety, on the kind of social trust that allows children to play unsupervised and doors to remain unlocked. The Lake Bodom murders forced a national reckoning with the reality that evil could strike anywhere, anytime, for no reason at all. The case spawned books, films, documentaries, even a Finnish metal band that took their name from the murders. There's something unsettling about that, isn't there? The way tragedy becomes entertainment, how real suffering transforms into cultural touchstones. But perhaps that's how we process the incomprehensible. We turn it into stories, songs, theories. We make it part of our mythology because the alternative, accepting that some things simply cannot be explained, is too terrifying to contemplate. Writers created fictional solutions to the real mystery. Filmmakers imagined motives that made sense, even if they weren't true. Musicians channeled the darkness into songs that gave voice to feelings too complex for ordinary language. In a way, these artistic interpretations became their own kind of justice, not the legal kind that remained elusive, but the human kind, the need to make meaning from chaos, to find beauty in darkness, to ensure that the victims were remembered for more than just the manner of their deaths. The Lake Bodom murders became Finland's most famous unsolved case, but fame is a curious thing when it's built on the graves of children. Each retelling, each new theory, each artistic interpretation was both a tribute and a violation, honoring the memory of the victims while simultaneously exploiting their tragedy for entertainment. Where's the line between remembrance and exploitation? between seeking truth and sensationalizing suffering? These are questions without easy answers, much like the case itself. In researching this case, I discovered something that chills me more than the murders themselves. The connections. Hans, the German suspect, linked to 5 other unsolved murders across Scandinavia. Patterns of violence that stretch across years, across borders, across the neat boundaries we use to make sense of chaos. Valdemar, the kiosk owner, had a history of threats and violence that extended far beyond his hatred of campers. Reports of attacks on hikers, confrontations with local children, incidents that were dismissed as the behavior of an eccentric old man rather than warning signs of something darker. How many other cases might be connected? How many other families are waiting for answers that may never come? The Lake Bodom murders weren't just an isolated incident. They were part of something larger, more complex, more terrifying. A web of violence with threads we're only beginning to trace. Each new connection raises more questions than it answers. If these cases are related, what does that say about the nature of evil? Is it truly random, or does it follow patterns we're not sophisticated enough to detect? And what about the cases we don't know about? The murders that were never reported, never investigated, never connected to any larger pattern? How many monsters have walked among us throughout history, leaving trails of destruction that we've never recognized as related? The Lake Bodom murders force us to confront not just one unsolved crime, but the possibility that unsolved crimes might be part of larger, more systematic horrors that operate beyond our understanding. Lake Bodom still exists, of course. The water still reflects the sky with mirror-like perfection. The pine trees still whisper their ancient secrets. Visitors come to see where it happened, drawn by morbid curiosity or genuine interest in the case. But the lake remembers everything, doesn't it? Every ripple on its surface, every shadow that has passed over its waters, every secret whispered on its shores. If we could somehow read those memories, will we finally understand what happened that night? Local guides will tell you the lake is haunted, not by ghosts in the traditional sense, but by the weight of unanswered questions, by the echo of violence that should never have touched such a peaceful place. Some visitors report feeling watched, followed, as if the darkness that claimed 3 young lives still lingers in the shadows between the trees. Others say the lake is healing itself, that time and nature are slowly washing away the stain of that terrible night. They point to the wildlife that has returned, the families who once again choose to camp on its shores, the way sunlight dances on the water as if nothing bad ever happened there. Both perspectives might be true. Maybe healing and haunting aren't opposites, but different faces of the same reality. Maybe the lake holds both the darkness of that night and the light of all the peaceful moments that came before and after. I think about the irony sometimes. How a place chosen for its beauty and isolation became famous for exactly those qualities. Lake Bodom was the perfect place for young love to flourish, and that same perfection made it the perfect place for evil to strike. This is what haunts me about the Lake Bodom murders. Not just the violence itself, but our inability to understand it. We live in a world that demands explanations, that insists every mystery can be solved with enough evidence, enough analysis, enough time. But what if some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved? What if the very act of trying to understand certain kind of evil only draws us deeper into darkness? We've created entire industries around solving crimes, entire entertainment genres based on the assumption that justice will eventually prevail, that truth will eventually emerge, that the good guys will eventually win. The Lake Bodom Murders challenge all of those comfortable assumptions. Maybe the most honest thing we can do is admit that we don't know, that despite decades of investigation, millions of words written, countless theories proposed, The truth remains as elusive as it was on that morning in June, when a carpenter discovered three young bodies by a peaceful lake. And maybe that's the real horror of this story, not just the violence itself, but the knowledge that some questions may never be answered, some wounds may never heal, some mysteries may be too dark for human comprehension. We tell ourselves that justice delayed is justice denied. We believe that every crime must have a perpetrator, every mystery a solution, every tragedy a meaning that makes the suffering worthwhile. But the Lake Bodom murders challenge those comforting beliefs. What if there is no satisfying explanation? What if evil sometimes strikes without reason, without pattern, without the narrative structure we desperately crave? What if the universe is more random, more cruel, more indifferent than we want to believe? The families of the victims have lived with these questions for over 60 years now. Some have found peace in their faith, others in their memories of their loved ones' lives rather than their deaths. Some have channeled their pain into advocacy, working to prevent other tragedies, to support other victims, to create meaning from meaninglessness. But others have been consumed by the unanswered questions, spending decades pursuing theories, investigating suspects, demanding answers that may not exist. Their pain is no less valid, their need for closure no less real, but their quest may be ultimately futile. Is it cruel to suggest that some questions don't have answers? Or is it crueler to offer false hope, to pretend that justice is inevitable, that truth always emerges, that good always triumphs over evil? Maybe the most impassionate thing we can do is sit with the uncertainty, to honor the victims without demanding that their deaths serve some larger purpose, to remember their lives without insisting that their murders make sense. I think about those four teenagers often, not as victims in a famous case, but as young people who deserve to grow old, to fall in love again, to make mistakes and learn from them, to contribute something beautiful to the world. Mila, who loved to laugh and believed in the goodness of people. If she had lived, would she have become the teacher she dreamed of being? Would her classroom have been filled with the same joy she brought to everything she touched? Anya, with her quiet wisdom and dreams of travel, would she have become a photographer, capturing beauty in unexpected places? Would her images have helped others see the world through her thoughtful, contemplative eyes? Seppo, protective and kind, who wanted to build something lasting with his hands. Would he have opened that garage he dreamed of? Would he have been the kind of father who taught his children that love means showing up, being present, putting others' safety before your own comfort? And Nils, who survived to carry a burden no 18-year-old should ever bear, guilty or innocent, his life was forever changed by that night. The boy who went to sleep under the stars believing in fairy tales woke up in a world where nightmares were real. They went to sleep surrounded by love, believing in the fundamental goodness of the world. They woke, those who woke at all, to discover its darkest truth, that evil exists, that it can strike without warning, without reason, without mercy. But here's what I've learned from studying cases like this. Evil may be incomprehensible, but it's not inevitable. For every night of horror, there are thousands of nights where young people camp by lakes and nothing terrible happens, where strangers pass in the darkness without violence, where the world reveals its beauty rather than its cruelty. The Lake Bodom murders remind us that evil exists, but they also remind us how rare it is, how precious our ordinary, peaceful moments truly are, how miraculous it is that most of us will live our entire lives without encountering the kind of darkness that claimed three young lives by a Finnish lake. Perhaps that's the only justice we can offer the dead, to cherish the light more deeply because we've glimpsed the darkness, to hold our loved ones closer because we understand how quickly they can be taken away, to choose kindness over cruelty, hope over despair, love over fear, and to remember that sometimes the most profound truths can't be solved, only witnessed, honored, and held in the careful custody of memory. The lake remembers everything, and perhaps that's enough.